They say time heals all wounds, but they're wrong. Time doesn't heal. It buries. But sometimes, the shallowest graves hold the most painful memories, and a cold rain is all it takes to wash away the thin layer of soil, exposing the skeleton of a betrayal for all to see. For Daniel, that rain was falling now, a relentless, miserable downpour that mirrored the storm inside his own heart. He stood before the towering oak door of the Harrison estate, a place he had never felt welcome, a place that now represented his last, desperate hope. The water dripped from his hair and soaked through his thin jacket, but the chill he felt had nothing to do with the weather. It was the ice of pure desperation, a cold dread that had been his constant companion for weeks. Inside that mansion was his wife, Jessica, and her family, a dynasty built on old money and older arrogance. And in a hospital bed across town, his mother was running out of time. The door swung open, not with a welcoming warmth, but with a reluctant, heavy groan. There stood Eleanor Harrison, his mother-in-law, her face a perfect mask of polite disdain. Behind her, his brother-in-law, Mark, lounged in a leather armchair, a smirk playing on his lips. And then he saw Jessica, his wife, standing near the fireplace, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable but far from loving. They looked at him as if he were a stray dog who had wandered onto their pristine lawn. His voice, when it came, was a ragged whisper, stripped of pride. He explained the situation, the sudden turn in his mother's illness, the surgeon's ultimatum, the impossible sum of money that stood between life and death. He wasn't begging for a handout, he told them, just a loan, a bridge to get him through the darkest moment of his life. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm outside. Then, it was broken by a sound that would haunt Daniel for the rest of his days. Laughter. It was Mark, a short, barking laugh filled with contempt. Alone? He sneered, finally sitting up straight. Why would we invest in another one of your sinking ships, Daniel? Eleanor chimed in, her voice like splinters of glass. Think of the family's reputation. We can't be seen throwing money at lost causes. Daniel's eyes pleaded with Jessica, searching for the woman he had married, the woman he thought he loved. But her face was cold, her eyes hard. She took a step forward, and for a fleeting second, he felt a surge of hope. Then she spoke, and that hope was extinguished forever. Daniel, stop embarrassing us, she said, her voice low and final. We don't have a single dollar for your pipe dreams. With that, the great oak door closed in his face, shutting out the storm, shutting out his hope, shutting out the man she had promised to love in sickness and in health. In that moment, standing alone in the rain, Daniel didn't feel sadness. He felt nothing. The love inside him, once a roaring fire, had turned to cold, hard ash. And in that chilling emptiness, a silent vow was forged. He would not forget this night. He would not forget their laughter. And he would rise from these ashes, not for revenge, but to build a world so high they could never, ever reach him. To understand the depth of the wound, you must first understand the beauty of the life that was killed. Before the cold rain and the closed door, there was sunshine, or at least what Daniel had mistaken for sunshine. It was a time when he believed that love was the world's greatest architect, capable of bridging any gap, fortifying any weakness. He saw his life with Jessica not as a fragile union of two different worlds, but as a masterpiece of engineering, a suspension bridge held aloft by the sheer, unbreakable tensile strength of their affection. He was a builder, after all. It was how he saw everything. He didn't come from a world of inheritances and trust funds. He came from a world of concrete, steel, and calloused hands. Raised by a single mother who worked double shifts at a local diner, Daniel learned early that the only thing you could truly own in this world was the strength in your back and the sharpness of your mind. He wasn't ashamed of his origins. In fact, he was proud of them. He saw dignity in work, beauty in a well-laid foundation, and honor in a promise kept. He was a talented structural engineer, a man who could see the soul of a building in its blueprint, who understood that the most important parts of any structure were the ones you couldn't see. He met Jessica at a fundraiser for a new city library, a project he had poured his heart into, working pro bono on the structural design. She was like a creature from another planet, radiant in a dress that probably cost more than his monthly salary, moving through the crowd with an effortless grace. He was in his work clothes, having come straight from the site, a smudge of dust on his cheek. He expected her to look through him, the way people of her class so often did. But she didn't. She stopped, and she smiled, and she asked him about the building. Not about the cost or the architect's famous name, but about the load-bearing walls and the way the light would fall in the reading room at dawn. Daniel was utterly captivated. He saw in her a curiosity and a depth that he thought transcended her privileged upbringing. For the first time, a woman didn't see the dirt under his fingernails, but the vision in his head. Or so he believed. Their courtship was a whirlwind romance, straight from a storybook, a collision of two vastly different American realities. He showed her his world of construction sites and sunrise coffees, and she showed him her world of art galleries and black-tie galas. He mistook her fascination for acceptance. He saw her excitement as a genuine desire to understand his life, not as the thrill of a tourist visiting a foreign land. When he proposed, he did so with a simple ring he had saved for months to afford, his heart pounding with the fear that it wasn't enough. But she said yes, with tears in her eyes, and in that moment, Daniel felt like the richest man on earth. He was so blinded by his love for her that he ignored the warning signs, the subtle cracks in the foundation of their future. The first time he met the Harrison family was at their cavernous mansion, a place that felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum dedicated to their own importance. Her father, a man with a tired, perpetually disappointed face, gave him a limp handshake and barely spoke another word to him all evening. Her brother, Mark, sized him up with the predatory gaze of a shark that had just spotted a smaller, slower fish. And her mother, Eleanor, was the most dangerous of all, for she wielded politeness like a finely sharpened knife. The family dinners became a recurring, ritualistic form of torture for Daniel. They were exercises in subtle humiliation, designed to remind him of his place. Eleanor would ask about his mother with a saccharine smile. "Oh, Daniel, how is your dear mother? It must be so exhausting, working on her feet all day. Such a noble profession." The word noble was dripped with a condescension so thick it soured the wine in his glass. Mark would dominate the conversation with talk of stock options and corporate mergers, then turn to Daniel with a dismissive wave. "It's complicated stuff, Daniel, all about moving capital. You probably wouldn't find it very interesting." In the beginning, Jessica would defend him, a little. A gentle, "Mark, be nice," or a reassuring squeeze of his hand under the vast mahogany table. Daniel clung to these small gestures like a lifeline. He told himself that she was on his side, that she was caught in the middle. He made excuses for her family, telling himself they were just old-fashioned and protective. He believed that if he could just prove himself, if his projects became successful enough, if he could just earn their respect, they would eventually see him for who he was. But over time, the hand-squeezing stopped. The weak defenses faded into an uncomfortable silence. He would catch her looking at him from across the table with a pained expression, and he realized with a slow, dawning horror that she wasn't embarrassed for her family's rudeness. She was embarrassed by his presence. He was the blemish on their perfect family portrait. His working-class accent, his simple stories about his job, his lack of knowledge about fine wines or European ski resorts, it all made her cringe. He now understood that Jessica had never truly left her family's world. She had just temporarily extended its borders to include him, a novelty item she could show off to her friends. The rebellious phase of dating a man who worked with his hands. But she had no intention of ever living in his world. She wanted him to change, to shed his past like a snake sheds its skin, and assimilate into hers. And Daniel, so desperately in love, had been willing to try. He read books he didn't care about, feigned interest in conversations that bored him to tears, and endured the endless, subtle cuts of their condescension. All for her. He believed this was the price of admission into her life, the cost of loving her. He never realized that the price was his own identity, his own soul. Looking back from the cold, harsh reality of that rainy night, he could see it all with perfect, painful clarity. The rosy past was a facade, a beautifully constructed set piece for a play in which he was the fool. He hadn't been a son-in-law. He had been a project, a curiosity. The foundation of their marriage wasn't love, it was his own naive, hopeful delusion. The storm that night hadn't come out of nowhere. It had been gathering for years, and the laughter he heard through the door was not just a denial of money, it was the final, gleeful confirmation of what he had always been to them: absolutely nothing. The illusion of a happy life, however flawed, can be a powerful anesthetic. For years, Daniel had willingly submitted to its numbing effect, ignoring the subtle aches and pains of his marriage to focus on the dream of what it could be. But a single phone call on a Tuesday afternoon that had been, until that moment, utterly unremarkable, was the jolt of cold adrenaline that brought all the pain rushing back with excruciating clarity. It was the hospital. The words the doctor used were clinical, detached, and terrifying. Infiltrating carcinoma, aggressive, prognosis is guarded. They were sterile, scientific terms for the monstrous thing that was growing inside his mother, the woman who was his entire world, his anchor, his truest north. He sat in a small beige-colored office, the doctor's voice fading into a low hum as he stared at the X-rays clipped to a light box. To him, it wasn't a collection of shadows and light, it was a map of his impending heartbreak. His mother, Maria, took the news with the same quiet, uncomplaining grace with which she had faced every other hardship in her life. She was a woman forged in resilience, who had raised a son on her own with tired hands and an unbreakable spirit. As she sat on the hospital bed, the thin blanket pulled up to her chin, her primary concern wasn't for herself, but for him. "Daniel, don't you worry about the money," she whispered, her voice weak but firm. "We'll manage. You can't stop your life for me." But he knew he would. His life, his work, his entire being had been a long effort to build a world where she would finally be safe and comfortable. The idea of failing her now was unthinkable. The surgeon explained the procedure, a complex and risky operation that offered the only real chance, but its cost was astronomical, and the portion not covered by her modest insurance plan might as well have been $1 billion. The storm had a name, and now it had a price tag. The first step was the easiest, a simple transfer of funds. He drained his life savings, every dollar he had painstakingly set aside, watching the number in his account dwindle to almost nothing. It felt like bleeding out. The sum, which once felt like a significant achievement, a testament to his hard work, was a mere drop in the ocean of what was needed. The real sacrifices came next, each one a small death of his past and his identity. He started with his truck. It was a 10-year-old Ford, dented and scratched, but it was his partner. It had carried him and his tools to his first solo jobs, hauled lumber for the deck he built for his mother, and been there for every pre-dawn departure. Selling it felt like cutting off a limb. He took the first cash offer he got, a number far below its worth, from a man who didn't see the history in the worn-out seat covers. He simply saw a cheap vehicle. Daniel walked away from the sale without looking back, the cash in his pocket feeling both heavy and insultingly light. Next went his father's watch, a vintage Omega he had left Daniel, the only tangible connection to a man he barely remembered. It was his one piece of luxury, his one link to a past that wasn't defined by struggle. He laid it on the velvet cushion of a pawn shop counter and watched the owner inspect it with a cynical eye. The man's offer was a pittance, but Daniel nodded, took the money, and left another piece of himself behind. Tools, books, a guitar he hadn't played in years, everything went. His small apartment grew barer, emptier, a reflection of the hollowing out feeling in his own chest. He began working like a man possessed, fueled by a desperate, frantic energy. He became a ghost haunting the city's construction sites, taking any job, no matter how small or grueling. He repaired leaky roofs in the pouring rain, built fences for demanding homeowners, patched drywall until his arms screamed with exhaustion. He worked 18-hour days, his body aching, his hands raw and bleeding. Sleep became a luxury he couldn't afford, and his diet consisted of stale coffee and whatever he could grab from a vending machine. The physical toll was immense. He grew thin, and dark circles formed under his eyes, making him look like a stranger in his own mirror. But the physical decay was nothing compared to the emotional rot that was setting into his marriage. In the beginning, Jessica offered a semblance of support. She would sigh and say, "Oh, Danny, that's just awful," when he told her about a new medical bill. But her sympathy was a shallow stream that quickly evaporated under the scorching heat of the problem's reality. The constant, suffocating presence of his mother's illness began to grate on her. His exhaustion made him a dull, silent presence in their home. Their conversations, once filled with shared dreams, were now grim financial reports. One evening, he came home later than usual, covered in a film of plaster dust and fatigue, but his eyes were alive with a sliver of hope. He'd spent hours researching an experimental treatment, a new protocol that showed promise. He tried to explain it to Jessica, his voice trembling with a fragile optimism. She listened with a growing impatience, tapping her perfectly manicured nails on their small kitchen table. When he finished, she didn't share his hope. She met it with a wall of cold pragmatism. "And how much will this one cost, Daniel?" she asked, her tone flat. "Have you even thought about that? We have nothing left. You're killing yourself working for a maybe." He stared at her, stunned. He had expected questions, even skepticism, but not this weary, dismissive annoyance. "It's my mother's life, Jess," he said, his voice cracking. She stood up and turned away from him, looking out the window at the glittering city that was her world, not his. "I know that," she said, her back still to him. "But maybe it's time to be realistic." That word realistic struck him with the force of a physical blow. To him, it was a synonym for giving up, for surrender. In that moment, he saw with blinding clarity that he was completely and utterly alone in this fight. His wife was not his partner. She was a spectator, watching from the sidelines, growing tired of the game. Her love, he realized, was a fair-weather thing, a luxury item that functioned perfectly in comfort and ease but broke down at the first sign of real hardship. The distance between them, once a matter of class and upbringing, was now a vast, unbridgeable chasm of the soul. He had bled his savings, sold his past, and worked his body to the point of collapse. Now, with everything else gone, he had only one final, desperate option left. He had to go to the Harrisons. He had to walk into the heart of their cold, glittering world and ask for help, knowing, deep down, that he was walking toward his own execution. The drive to the Harrison estate was a blur of slick roads and distorted, neon lights bleeding through the rain-streaked windshield. Each mile closer felt like a step deeper into enemy territory. Daniel had rehearsed his speech 100 times, trying to find the right combination of words that would convey desperation without sacrificing the last shred of his dignity. But as he pulled up to the enormous wrought iron gates and announced himself through the intercom, he knew that dignity was a luxury he had already lost. He was a beggar, and this was his final, most humiliating appeal. The house stood at the end of a long, winding driveway, a monument of stone and glass that seemed to challenge the stormy sky itself. It wasn't just a house, it was a declaration of power, designed to make any visitor feel small and insignificant. Tonight, it was succeeding brilliantly. He walked up the marble steps, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs, and rang the bell. The chimes echoed from deep within, a melodious, hollow sound. The great oak doors swung open, and for a moment, he was blinded by the light. As his eyes adjusted, he saw them, arranged in the grand foyer like a formal portrait of indifference. Eleanor was seated on a velvet settee, her posture rigid, her pearls gleaming softly against her silk blouse. Mark stood by a large, ornate table, swirling brandy in a snifter, the very picture of bored entitlement, and Jessica. His wife stood slightly apart from them, near the grand staircase, her arms clasped in front of her. She looked beautiful, as always, but her beauty was cold, sculpted from ice. They watched him as he stepped inside, dripping rainwater onto their priceless Persian rug. No one moved to offer him a towel. No one spoke a word of greeting. They simply stared, their collective gaze a physical weight that pressed down on him. "Thank you for seeing me," Daniel began, his voice raspy, unfamiliar to his own ears. He hated the weakness in it, but he pushed on, forcing the words out. He explained everything again, more clearly this time. laying bare the raw, ugly facts of the situation. The failed treatments, the mounting debt, the surgeon's stark prognosis, the single, terrifyingly expensive operation that was his mother's only hope. His eyes kept finding Jessica's, pleading with her, trying to remind her of the man she had once claimed to love, of the vows they had taken. "Jess," he finished, his voice breaking, "she's my mother, please." The silence that followed stretched into an eternity. It was Eleanor who spoke first, her voice smooth and coated in a thin veneer of civility that barely concealed the steel beneath. "Daniel," she said, placing her teacup on its saucer with a delicate click, "we understand that you are emotional. It's a difficult situation for you, but you must understand our position. A loan of this nature is not simply a financial matter. It is a matter of prudence. Our family's reputation is built on generations of sound judgment." Mark let out a short, humorless laugh, taking a sip of his brandy. "Judgment is one word for it, Mother. Let's call it what it is, a terrible investment." He began to pace slowly, circling Daniel like a shark. "We are in the business of building wealth, Daniel, not funding personal crises. Why would we throw our capital into a situation with no return? You talk about saving your mother. But from a business perspective, you're a sinking ship. You've stumbled from one failed project to the next. What guarantee do we have that we'll ever see this money again?" Daniel felt a hot surge of anger but swallowed it down. Arguing with them was pointless. They were speaking a different language, a dialect of profit and loss that had no words for love or loyalty. He turned his full attention to Jessica, his last and only hope. "Jessica, don't let them talk like this. This isn't a business deal. This is family." He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a brief, tormented shadow. She looked from his desperate face to her mother's implacable one, then to her brother's smug sneer. Daniel could see the war raging inside her, but he could also see which side was winning. He watched as her spine straightened, her chin lifted, and the last vestiges of the woman he loved were erased, replaced by the cool, calculating demeanor of a true Harrison. "Daniel, you're not thinking clearly," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Not thinking clearly?" he repeated, incredulous. "They're talking about money, about their reputation. I'm talking about my mother's life." This was it. The final moment. The breaking point. Jessica took a step forward, closing the small distance between them. Her eyes, which he once thought held galaxies of affection, were now 2 chips of cold, polished stone. "And you," she said, her voice dropping to a low, venomous whisper that was for him alone, "are embarrassing me. You are embarrassing us." She glanced back at her family, a silent signal of her allegiance. "They are right. You come in here, looking like this, begging. It's pathetic." She then raised her voice so her mother and brother could hear her final verdict. "We can't help you, Daniel. It's time for you to leave." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command, an eviction, an excommunication. The words hung in the air, more final than any legal document, more cutting than any knife. She had not just refused him. She had judged him, sided with them, and cast him out. Mark opened the great oak door, a triumphant smirk on his face. Daniel stood frozen for a second, the shock so profound it was like being submerged in ice water. He looked at the 3 of them, a united front of wealth and heartlessness, and realized he had never been part of their family. He had only ever been a guest, and his visiting hours were now over. He turned without another word and walked back out into the storm, but the rain felt different now. It was no longer just water. It was the world weeping for his loss. The heavy door slammed shut behind him, the click of the lock echoing in the night. That sound was the end of his marriage, the end of his hope, the end of the man he used to be. A profound, hollow emptiness settled in his chest, a vacuum where his heart used to be. He had been abandoned, not just by his wife's family, but by his wife herself. In the coldest moment of his life, she had chosen to leave him shivering in the dark. The weeks that followed that night were a long, slow descent into a gray, soundless abyss. Hope, once a flickering candle, had been snuffed out, leaving behind only the acrid smoke of reality. The world outside the hospital walls ceased to exist for Daniel. His small, empty apartment was just a place to shower and change. The construction sites he used to love were ghost towns, and the ringing of his phone was a nuisance to be ignored. His entire universe shrank to the size of his mother's room, a sterile white box filled with the rhythmic beeping of machines that were merely counting down the inevitable. He sat by her bedside, holding her frail hand, the calluses on his own feeling rough and useless against her paper-thin skin. He read to her from her favorite books, his voice a low monotone, the words turning to ash in his mouth. He watched the numbers on the monitors, watched the life slowly, inexorably fade from her eyes, and a cold, hard knot of rage and grief tightened in his chest. The cruelty of the Harrisons had done more than just deny him a chance to save her. They had poisoned these last precious days. Instead of filling them with peace and love, he had filled them with frantic work and humiliating desperation. They had stolen this from him, and it was a theft for which there could be no forgiveness. Maria passed away on a quiet Sunday morning, not with a bang, but with a soft, final sigh. The machines fell silent, one by one, leaving a stillness in the room that was more deafening than any noise. In her last lucid moment, she had looked at him, a faint smile touching her lips, and whispered, "You were a good son, Daniel, the very best." Those words were both a comfort and a dagger. He had been a good son, but he hadn't been a powerful one. He hadn't been able to protect her. As he walked out of the hospital and into the indifferent sunlight, he felt a profound, tectonic shift within him. The grief was a vast ocean, but beneath it, the bitterness of betrayal was hardening into something new. It was a foundation. The funeral was a small, quiet affair, attended only by a handful of his mother's co-workers from the diner and a few old neighbors. They spoke of her kindness, her laughter, her resilience. There were no Harrisons present. Jessica did not call. She did not send flowers. She did not acknowledge the death of her mother-in-law in any way. Her absence was not a surprise, but it was a final, glaring confirmation. It was an announcement to the world, or at least to the 10 people gathered by the graveside, that the connection was severed, that she felt nothing. As Daniel stood alone, watching the simple wooden casket being lowered into the earth, he felt a chilling sense of release. He was no longer bound to them. He was free. 2 days later, he met with a lawyer and filed for divorce. He did it with the same dispassionate efficiency as one would sign off on a demolition permit for a condemned building. The structure was already rotten beyond repair. This was just the official paperwork. Jessica's response came through her own lawyer. There was no emotion, no argument, no regret. It was all business. She wanted the apartment, half the value of the truck he had already sold, and an accounting of their joint bank account, which she knew perfectly well was empty. Her cold, mercenary calculations were the final insult on his mother's memory. She was squabbling over the ashes of their life together, while the grief was still raw in his soul. He signed everything without a fight. She could have the worthless scraps. He was about to start building something far more valuable. A week after the funeral, when the well-wishers had gone and the sympathy cards had stopped coming, Daniel returned to the cemetery. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns. He stood before the fresh plot of earth, a simple headstone marking his mother's final resting place. The rage had subsided now, the searing heat cooling into something harder, denser, like forged steel. He didn't speak aloud, but in the silent chambers of his heart, he made a vow. It was a promise whispered to the soul of the only person who had ever truly loved him. "I'm sorry, Mom," he thought, the words clear and sharp in his mind. "I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough. I wasn't rich enough. I wasn't enough. I let you down." A single tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. He wiped it away with the back of his hand, not with sadness, but with anger. "That ends today. I'm not going to seek revenge. Revenge is a fool's game, a fire that consumes the person who starts it. They aren't worth the energy of my hatred. No, I'm going to do something far more devastating. I am going to build." He looked out over the horizon, at the distant city skyline, a landscape of towers built by men of ambition and power. "I will build an empire, Mom." not with their dirty money or their cutthroat tactics, but with my own 2 hands and my own mind. I will create a company on a foundation of the values you taught me: honesty, integrity, and relentless hard work. I will become so successful that my name will be a monument. My success will not be a weapon to destroy them, but a mirror that will force them to look at their own twisted souls every single day. They will read about my company in the financial pages. They will see buildings made from my designs rise into the sky. They will hear my name spoken with respect in the circles they value so much. They won't be ruined by me. They will be haunted by me. Their punishment will be the slow, corrosive acid of regret, the knowledge of what they cast aside in their arrogance. They laughed at me for being poor. One day, they will have to reckon with my wealth, a wealth built not just of money, but of purpose. This is my promise to you. As the last sliver of sun disappeared below the horizon, Daniel turned and walked away from the grave. He did not look back. The man who had loved Jessica Harrison, the man who had pleaded for help on a rainy night, the boy who had wept for his mother, that man was buried in the grave beside her. The person who walked out of the cemetery gates was someone new. He was a man with nothing left to lose and a world to build. He was an architect of his own destiny, and his blueprint was a vow etched in ash and sorrow. The shell of Daniel's old life was discarded with startling speed. He walked out of the apartment he had once shared with Jessica, carrying only 2 cardboard boxes, one filled with clothes, the other with his engineering textbooks and notebooks. He left behind the furniture they had picked out together, the photographs on the walls, the ghost of a life that was no longer his. He didn't look back. There was nothing there for him but memories, and memories were a luxury he could no longer afford. His new home was a 3rd-floor walk-up in a part of the city the Harrisons didn't even know existed. It was a single room with a small, grimy kitchen alcove and a bathroom where the shower's water pressure was more of a suggestion than a reality. The air smelled of damp and his neighbor's cooking, and the constant symphony of traffic and sirens from the street below was a stark contrast to the suffocating silence of the Harrison estate. To anyone else, it would have been a miserable, depressing box. To Daniel, it was a sanctuary. It was a blank slate. It was the perfect place for a demolition and a new construction. In this monastic cell, surrounded by peeling paint and cracked linoleum, Daniel unboxed his real ambition. It wasn't a new idea, born from the fire of his recent trauma, but an old dream he had nurtured for years in the back of his mind, a concept he would sketch out on napkins and in the margins of his notebooks. It was a solution to a problem that had always bothered him as an engineer: the incredible wastefulness of his industry. He envisioned a new kind of building material, one that was not quarried from the earth, but resurrected from the refuse of society. He called his theoretical creation lithos, from the ancient Greek word for stone. His idea was to take industrial byproducts, the slag from steel mills, fly ash from power plants, even recycled plastics and crushed glass, and, through a proprietary bonding process involving intense pressure and heat, transform this discarded junk into a building block that was superior to traditional concrete. In his designs, lithos was lighter, stronger, cheaper to produce, and almost perfectly eco-friendly. It was a beautiful, elegant concept, creating the strongest of foundations from the weakest and most unwanted of materials. The metaphor was not lost on him. He too felt like a discarded thing. Now, he would see if he could rebuild himself into something unbreakable. His life distilled down to a simple, brutal rhythm. By day, he was a ghost in the machine of the city's construction industry, taking on anonymous, back-breaking labor jobs. He was no longer an engineer. He was just another body, hauling drywall, pouring concrete, and framing houses for other people's dreams. He worked without complaint, his muscles aching, his mind distant. Every dollar he earned was divided 3 ways: a pittance for rent, a little for the cheapest food he could find, and the rest funneled directly into his project. By night, his tiny apartment transformed into a makeshift laboratory. A workbench made from stacked cinder blocks and a sheet of plywood became his altar. He bought used scientific equipment, beakers, scales, a small, high-temperature kiln that pushed his apartment's ancient electrical wiring to its absolute limit. The room was perpetually filled with a fine gray dust, and the strange, acrid smell of his experiments. This was the crucible. He worked with a singular, obsessive focus that bordered on madness. Sleep became an afterthought, a brief surrender to total exhaustion for 2 or 3 hours before he would jolt awake, an idea or a new formula burning in his mind. His diet consisted of instant noodles, cheap coffee brewed to the consistency of tar, and the occasional protein bar. He grew gaunt, his cheekbones sharp, his eyes sunken and burning with a feverish intensity. He was utterly alone. He spoke to no one beyond what was necessary for his day job. His only companions were the ghosts in his head. In moments of crushing fatigue, when his body screamed for rest, he would hear Mark Harrison's sneering voice in his ear. A sinking ship, a failed project. The memory was like a whip, driving him back to his feet, back to the workbench. When a batch of lithos failed to set, crumbling into useless powder in his hands, he would see Eleanor's look of utter disdain, her silent judgment that he was, and always would be, a failure. And in his darkest hours, when the loneliness felt like a physical weight threatening to crush him, he would conjure the memory of his mother's face, the unwavering belief in her eyes. "You can build anything, Danny," she used to tell him. Those two forces, the searing hatred for what the Harrisons represented and the profound love for the woman they had let die, became the twin engines of his will. The failures were relentless. For months, his apartment was a graveyard of broken bricks and discarded formulas. He created mixtures that were too brittle, cracking under the slightest pressure. He created others that were too heavy, dense lumps of useless material. He nearly set the apartment on fire twice. Any sane person would have given up, chalking it up to another pipe dream, just as Jessica had called it. But Daniel was no longer just sane. He was driven. He worked through his grief, mixing it into his formulas. He processed his anger, firing it in his kiln. He was not just trying to invent a new product, he was performing an act of alchemy on his own soul, trying to transmute his pain into power. Then, one night, after nearly a year of relentless, soul-crushing effort, it happened. He had tried a new bonding agent, a new temperature curve in the kiln. He pulled the test brick out, a perfectly formed, slate-gray rectangle. It felt different in his hands, denser, yet lighter than it should have been. He set it on the concrete floor of his building's basement. He picked up the sledgehammer he'd bought for this exact purpose. He took a deep breath, the ghosts of his past whispering in his ears. He swung. The hammer came down with all the force of his grief and rage. The impact sent a shockwave up his arms, and a loud, ringing crack echoed through the basement. But it wasn't the brick that had cracked. The head of the sledgehammer had a deep, spiderweb fracture in the steel. The brick of lithos had a small white mark on its surface, nothing more than a scratch. He dropped the broken hammer and stared. He ran his trembling fingers over the impossibly smooth, hard surface of the brick. He had done it. He had created something unbreakable from garbage. A quiet, single sob escaped his lips, a sound not of sadness, but of profound, earth-shattering relief. On the floor of a forgotten basement, in the heart of his own private hell, Daniel had just laid the first, indestructible cornerstone of his new world. One perfect, unbreakable brick was not a business, it was a promise. To turn that promise into a reality, Daniel knew he had to leave the crucible of his tiny apartment and expose his creation to the harsh, unforgiving light of the real world. He spent the last of his meager funds to rent a small, self-storage unit and produce a small but flawless batch of lithos bricks. He was no longer just an inventor. He had to become a salesman, a role that felt as foreign to him as the lavish lifestyle of the Harrisons. He didn't have connections or a marketing budget. All he had was the product itself. He started small, approaching independent contractors, the kind of grizzled, no-nonsense men he had worked alongside for years. Most dismissed him, seeing a desperate man with a wild claim. But one, a man named Sal, who ran a small landscaping company, saw something in Daniel's burning intensity. He was skeptical, but Daniel made him an offer he couldn't refuse. He would provide the lithos for free to build a large retaining wall for a client, and if it didn't outperform standard concrete block in every way, Daniel would pay to have it torn down and replaced at his own expense. Sal agreed, and for a week, Daniel worked alongside Sal's crew, not as an engineer, but as a laborer, showing them how to work with the new material. The crew was amazed. The lithos bricks were lighter, making the work faster and less taxing. They could be cut cleanly with standard masonry saws, and their interlocking design made the structure incredibly stable. When the wall was finished, it was a thing of simple, powerful beauty. The client was thrilled. Sal, a man not given to hyperbole, clapped Daniel on the shoulder and said, "Kid, I don't know what the hell this stuff is, but you're gonna be rich." The word of mouth spread like wildfire through the small, tight-knit community of local builders. Daniel's smart stone became a local legend, a secret weapon for those in the know. This small-town buzz eventually reached the ears of George Peterson, the owner of a mid-sized regional construction firm. George was an old-school builder, a man who had seen countless fads come and go, but he was also facing shrinking profit margins and the rising costs of traditional materials. He invited Daniel to his office. Daniel showed up in his work boots and a clean but frayed flannel shirt, carrying a single lithos brick in a canvas bag. He didn't have a PowerPoint presentation or slick marketing brochures. He placed the brick on George's heavy oak desk and told his story. He then took George to the retaining wall, handed him a sledgehammer, and told him to have at it. George, a powerfully built man, swung the hammer with all his might. The resulting clang echoed through the quiet suburban street, and the hammer bounced off, leaving a barely visible scuff mark. George stared at his vibrating hands, then at the brick, and then at Daniel with a newfound respect. He offered Daniel a small but crucial investment, enough to lease a proper workshop, buy industrial-grade mixers and kilns, and hire a small team. Daniel agreed, but on one non-negotiable condition. He would retain complete controlling ownership. Never again would he be at the mercy of someone else's money. With George's backing, Daniel officially incorporated Phoenix Materials. The name was a quiet tribute to his own rebirth from the ashes of his former life. He hired a small crew of hard-working men and women, people who, like him, had been overlooked and underestimated. His workshop was not a corporate office. It was a place of dust, noise, and constant innovation. He was not a boss who gave orders from behind a desk. He was a leader who worked alongside his team, his hands as dirty as theirs. The company grew steadily, building a reputation for a revolutionary product and an unshakable integrity. The tipping point came a year later. A trade journal published a feature on sustainable building materials and dedicated a full page to Phoenix Materials, calling lithos the most significant advancement in construction since the invention of reinforced concrete. That article landed on the desk of Anya Sharma, a partner at a top-tier venture capital firm in San Francisco that specialized in disruptive green technologies. She flew across the country to meet Daniel in his dusty workshop. The meeting was a world away from his conversation with George. Anya arrived with a team of analysts and lawyers. They spoke of market penetration, scalability, and exit strategies. They saw in lithos not just a better brick, but a multi-billion-dollar global enterprise. Daniel, however, was no longer the desperate, trembling man who had stood in the Harrisons' foyer. He was calm, prepared, and quietly confident. He listened to their pitch, answered their technical questions with a precision that left their analysts scrambling to keep up, and negotiated the terms of their investment with the cool, unshakable demeanor of a man who knew the absolute value of what he had created. He secured a massive round of funding that would launch Phoenix Materials into the stratosphere, and he did it without surrendering a single percentage of his controlling stake. The years that followed were a blur of explosive growth. Phoenix Materials went from a regional player to a national powerhouse, and then a global leader in sustainable construction. Lithos was used in everything from affordable housing projects to cutting-edge skyscrapers. Daniel became the face of a new generation of industry, a CEO who was both an innovator and a throwback to the old values of hard work. He became wealthy beyond his wildest dreams, but the man himself changed very little on the surface. He still drove a practical car, a high-end electric sedan, a nod to his company's ethos, but not a flashy supercar. He lived in a comfortable but understated modern home, not a sprawling mansion. He wore expensive, well-tailored suits, but they were a uniform for his job, not a costume for a lifestyle. The fire that had once consumed him had now been banked, transformed into the controlled, hyper-efficient burn of a blast furnace. The most noticeable change was in his eyes. They were the eyes of a general, constantly scanning, analyzing, assessing. There was a distance to them, a cool, guarded quality that kept the world at arm's length. He was polite, respected, even admired, but he was not known. He had built impenetrable walls around his heart, each one mortared with the memory of betrayal. His wealth was not a source of joy, it was a tool, a shield. He poured millions into a foundation in his mother's name, dedicated to helping underprivileged students pursue careers in engineering. He ensured his employees were the best paid in the industry. His money was his power, the ultimate guarantee that he, and anyone he chose to protect, would never be helpless again. He had risen. He was the phoenix. He was a king in a silent, solitary castle of his own making. Years passed, each one a testament to the vow Daniel had made at his mother's grave. The world in which he now moved was a universe away from the dust and desperation of his past. It was a world of quarterly earnings reports, international logistics, and strategic acquisitions. He navigated boardrooms with the same quiet intensity he had once reserved for his workshop, his mind a finely tuned instrument for building not just materials, but an empire. Phoenix Materials had become a titan of the industry, a name synonymous with innovation and integrity. And Daniel, the architect of it all, remained a figure of quiet, formidable power. He had built his fortress, and from its highest tower, the world looked very different. The past had become a distant country, a place he rarely, if ever, chose to visit. But sometimes, whispers from that country would find their way across the border, carried on the cold, impartial winds of the financial press. The first whisper came in the form of a small article buried in the back section of the Wall Street Journal under a column titled, "Legacy in Decline." The article was a broad analysis of old money family businesses that were failing to adapt to the 21st century economy. It used Harrison Holdings as its prime case study. Daniel saw the name and paused, his coffee cup hovering midway to his lips. There was no jolt of anger, no surge of satisfaction. There was only a quiet, clinical curiosity, the way an engineer might study the structural report of a building he already knew was condemned. The article painted a grim picture. Harrison Holdings, once a respectable player in the luxury import-export market, was now hemorrhaging money. Their business model, built on handshake deals and a reputation that no longer carried weight in a globalized digital marketplace, was obsolete. The author pointed to a critical failure in leadership, a stubborn refusal to innovate, and, most damningly, a series of disastrously high-risk investments apparently spearheaded by the new COO, Mark Harrison. Daniel read the article twice, not with emotion, but with the dispassionate eye of a strategist. He could see their mistakes laid out as clearly as a faulty blueprint. They were arrogant. They believed their name was a shield that made them immune to the rules of modern commerce. And Mark, in a desperate attempt to appear like a financial genius, had turned the company's capital into his personal casino chips. Daniel closed the newspaper and went about his day. The information was just a data point, filed away in the vast archives of his mind. He felt nothing. It was exactly as he had predicted. A structure built on a rotten foundation was, inevitably, going to collapse. A few months later, a second whisper reached him. This time, it was more specific. A trade publication reported that Harrison Holdings had sold off its primary warehouse and logistics fleet to a competitor to cover massive debts. This was no longer just a sign of struggle. It was a public signal of deep, systemic distress. They weren't just losing money, they were liquidating the very bones of their operation. He heard more through the ambient noise of his new world. At an industry dinner, he overheard two executives from a logistics firm talking. "The Harrisons are a sinking ship," one said to the other, the exact words Mark had once used against him. "I hear their suppliers are demanding cash on delivery." Young Mark Harrison apparently bet the farm on some crypto scheme and lost his shirt. The other man shook his head. "Nepotism is a cancer. The old man should have never handed the reins to that arrogant fool. Daniel continued eating his meal, his expression unchanging. The irony was so thick, it was almost tasteless. He began to follow the story with a detached, academic interest. He set up a discreet news alert for Harrison Holdings, and every few weeks, another piece of the story would fall into place. Mark, in a panic, had doubled down on his reckless strategy. After the crypto failure, he had tried to recoup the losses by investing heavily in a speculative real estate development that went bankrupt. He had tried to launch a new line of products that were poorly researched and completely out of touch with modern consumer tastes. Each move was a frantic, clumsy attempt to fix a problem he himself had created, and each attempt only made the situation worse. The whispers grew louder, turning into rumors of massive layoffs, of bounced checks, of Eleanor Harrison selling off her personal jewelry collection to make payroll. Daniel sat in his minimalist, top-floor office late one night, the city lights twinkling below like a fallen constellation. On one of his monitors was the live data stream of Phoenix Materials' global stock performance, a steady, upward-climbing green line. On the other, he had pulled up the latest news about Harrison Holdings. They were facing foreclosure on their corporate headquarters. He stared at the two screens, side by side. One represented creation, growth, and relentless forward momentum. The other represented decay, arrogance, and the slow, agonizing death of an era. He felt no joy. The idea of taking pleasure in their downfall felt cheap beneath him. The fire of his youthful rage had long since burned out, leaving behind a profound, unshakable calm. What he felt instead was a strange and distant pity. It was a pity for the sheer, tragic waste of it all. They had been given every advantage, a family name, wealth, connections, and had squandered it all because they lacked the two things that truly mattered: character and wisdom. They mistook their privilege for skill. They believed they were masters of a game they didn't even understand. He had started with nothing but grief and an idea, and he had built an empire. They had started with an empire, and through their own hubris, had reduced it to rubble. The justice unfolding before him was not the hot, satisfying vengeance of a movie. It was the cold, impartial, and inevitable justice of mathematics. It was the simple, unalterable law of cause and effect. Arrogance plus incompetence equals failure. It was the universe balancing its own books. He closed the news article, the story of their demise, just another whisper in the quiet of his office. He had not lifted a finger against them. He had not needed to. His vow at his mother's grave had not been about their destruction, but about his own creation. Their self-destruction was merely an incidental, predictable byproduct. The whispers from the past were fading, soon to be replaced by the silence of their complete and utter irrelevance. The whispers from the past had been like the distant rumble of a coming storm, a gradual darkening on the horizon. But the storm itself, when it finally broke, was not a whisper. It was a thunderclap, a blinding flash of lightning that illuminated, for the entire world to see, the complete and utter ruin of the House of Harrison. The news arrived not as a rumor or an article buried in the business section, but as a headline news alert that buzzed on Daniel's phone during a board meeting. Harrison Holdings files for Chapter 7. Bankruptcy, citing insurmountable debt. Chapter 7. Not reorganization, liquidation. It was the corporate equivalent of a death certificate. Daniel looked at the alert, his face an impassive mask. He politely excused himself from the meeting, walked to the floor-to-ceiling window of his corner office, and stared down at the sprawling city below. The storm had finally made landfall. The days that followed were a media-feeding frenzy. The collapse of a prominent, multi-generational family business was a story too juicy to ignore. Financial news outlets, which had once reported on the Harrisons' social galas and charitable donations, now picked apart the carcass of their failed company with brutal forensic detail. Daniel watched it all from his detached perch, an observer to the public autopsy of the family who had cast him out. He read detailed reports that laid their finances bare, showing a mountain of debt so high it defied belief. Analysts and former employees were quoted, all telling the same story. A once stable company had been systematically dismantled from the inside by the hubris and incompetence of its heir, Mark Harrison. He was painted as a reckless gambler who treated the company coffers as his personal slush fund, a fool who mistook arrogance for business acumen. Eleanor was portrayed as an out-of-touch matriarch, a Marie Antoinette of the modern age, who was more concerned with appearances than with the glaring reality of their impending doom. Her desperate, futile attempts to protect the family's reputation were now the very reason for its public immolation. But the most devastating blow, the one that transcended the cold finality of bankruptcy court, was the loss of the mansion. The estate, that fortress of arrogance and old money, was their most significant remaining asset, and it was seized by the banks. The local news ran a segment on it, and Daniel watched it on his office computer, the sound turned off. The camera panned across the familiar, manicured lawns, now looking unkempt and forlorn. There were images of auctioneers in cheap suits walking through the hallowed halls, placing numbered tags on everything. The antique furniture, the oil paintings of stern-faced Harrison ancestors, the grand piano in the ballroom. He saw a shot of the great oak door, the one that had been slammed in his face, now propped wide open as movers unceremoniously hauled out the contents of their lives. The place where he had suffered his greatest humiliation was now the stage for their own. He didn't need to imagine their pain or their shame. It was being broadcast for anyone to see. The symbol of their power had become a monument to their failure. The irony was staggering, a narrative so perfectly symmetrical that it felt like the work of a master storyteller. On the same day that Bloomberg published a scathing, in-depth article titled, "How Pride and Recklessness Toppled the Harrison Dynasty," Forbes released its annual 30 Under 40 issue. On the cover was Daniel, hailed as a visionary of the new industrial age. He sat at his desk and looked at the two articles on his screen, side by side. The world was telling two stories. One was of his creation. Phoenix Materials was lauded for its record-breaking profits, its revolutionary technology, and its progressive corporate culture that was creating thousands of jobs. The other was of their destruction. Harrison Holdings was a cautionary tale of nepotism, stagnation, and catastrophic failure. The words used to describe him were disciplined, innovative, brilliant. The words used to describe Mark were erratic, entitled, a failure. He felt no elation, no thrill of victory. The satisfaction he had once craved, the desire to see them humbled, had long since evaporated. To feel pleasure in their demise would be to admit that they still had some hold over him, that his emotional state was still tied to theirs. But it wasn't. He had risen so far that their fall was merely a distant event on the landscape below. What he felt instead was a profound sense of closure. The long, complex equation of his past had finally been solved. The scales that had been so unjustly tipped that night in the rain had now been balanced, not by his hand, but by the impartial, inexorable weight of consequence. They hadn't just been defeated in business. The very philosophy by which they lived that name and birthright were superior to merit and hard work had been publicly debunked and discredited. He thought of Eleanor, so obsessed with her reputation. Her reputation was now in ashes, defined forever by this spectacular collapse. He thought of Mark, who had mocked him for being a sinking ship. Mark had proven to be the most inept captain of all, steering his own family's vessel directly into an iceberg of his own making. And he thought of Jessica, who had chosen the perceived security of her family's wealth over the uncertainty of her husband's love. She had hitched her wagon to a dying star, and now she was left with nothing but the darkness. He read the final news clipping about the estate. The mansion and all its contents had been sold at auction to a newly minted tech billionaire. It would be gutted, renovated, its Harrison past scrubbed clean to make way for a new era. The story was over. Daniel closed the browser tab. He didn't bookmark the articles. He didn't save the clippings. He simply erased them. Their fall was now a matter of public record, a historical fact. They had been rendered utterly and completely irrelevant. As the last echoes of their collapsed empire faded into silence, Daniel turned back to his own work, to the blueprints of the future. The chapter was closed. The ghosts were vanquished. All that was left was for them to realize it. The silence that followed the collapse of the Harrison Empire was, for Daniel, a quiet, productive peace. He was a man who had become comfortable with silence, who found strength in its uncluttered spaces. The ghosts of the past had been exorcised by the public spectacle of their failure, and he was finally, completely, free to focus on the future. He had won. The story was over. He had moved on. But he had made one critical miscalculation. He had assumed they had moved on, too. He had forgotten the cardinal rule of the desperate. They do not respect endings. They only look for new beginnings, new angles, new lifelines. The first call came on a Tuesday night. Daniel was in his home office, a space of clean lines, dark wood, and quiet efficiency. Reviewing architectural plans for a new pediatric wing, his foundation was funding at the city hospital. His phone, which was usually silent after business hours, vibrated on the polished surface of his desk. The screen showed an unknown number. His first instinct was to ignore it. His life was now carefully curated to filter out the unnecessary, the unscheduled. But some intuition, some faint echo of the past, made him reach for it. He answered, his voice a neutral, professional, "Hello?" A hesitant, shaky voice on the other end responded, "Daniel? It's Jessica?" The name dropped into the quiet of the room, like a stone into a perfectly still pond. For a moment, Daniel felt nothing at all, just a mild, clinical surprise. He said nothing, his silence stretching down the line, a vast, empty space that she was forced to fill. I know it's been a long time," she stammered. The once confident, melodious voice, now thin and reedy, stripped of all its former arrogance. It was the voice of someone who had been humbled, or at least had learned to fake humility. "I know I have no right to call you, but I've been thinking a lot about us, about the past. I was just so lost back then. I let my family influence me. It was the biggest mistake of my life, Daniel. I hope you know that." He remained silent. He was a stone wall, and she was throwing pebbles of pathetic, self-serving apologies against him, listening to them fall uselessly to the ground. He could hear the manufactured sorrow in her voice, the carefully rehearsed regret. It was a performance, and a poor one at that. "Do you remember that little Italian place on Grove Street?" she continued, her voice taking on a wistful, saccharine quality. "The one with the checkered tablecloths? I was thinking about that the other day. We were so happy then, weren't we?" He did remember. He remembered that she had complained the entire time that the wine was cheap and the neighborhood was run down. He said nothing. "I've been following your success," she gushed, changing tactics. "Phoenix Materials. It's incredible, Daniel. I am so proud of you. I always knew you had it in you. I always believed in you, even when." Her voice trailed off, leaving the lie hanging in the air between them. Daniel felt a flicker of something then, not anger, but a cold, profound pity. Not for her, but for the memory of the young man who had once loved this woman so blindly that he would have believed such a transparent falsehood. He was listening to a stranger, a desperate creature wearing the face of his former wife. "Things have been difficult," she said, her voice finally cracking with a hint of genuine desperation. "For my family, we lost everything. My father's health is failing. My mother, she's not the same. And Mark, it's all been a nightmare." She was painting a portrait of victimhood, as if their ruin had been a random tragedy, a bolt of lightning from a clear sky, and not the direct, inevitable consequence of their own actions. Finally, she came to the point. "I was hoping. I know it's a lot to ask, but I was hoping we could meet? For coffee? Just to talk. To catch up. Please, Daniel. For the sake of what we once had." He had been waiting for it. The ask. The plea veiled as a friendly reunion. She didn't want to talk. She wanted an ATM. He considered simply hanging up. He considered telling her the cold, hard truth of what he thought of her and her family. But he did neither. Instead, a cold, clear sense of purpose began to form in his mind. The story wasn't quite over. There was one final chapter to be written. "I'll have to check my schedule, Jessica," he said, his voice perfectly level, betraying nothing. "Let me think about it." He hung up before she could respond, leaving her dangling on a hook of his own making. Her call was the opening of the floodgates. 2 days later, Mark called. His voice was unrecognizable. The sneering, arrogant tone was gone, replaced by a rough, defeated rasp. He didn't even try to feign friendship. His approach was one of groveling submission. "Daniel, it's Mark Harrison. Look, man, I don't know what to say. I was a complete jackass. I was a monster to you, I know that. And I've lost everything because of my own stupidity. I'm calling to beg. For a job. Any job. I'll sweep the floors in your factories. I need to work. Please." The next day, it was Eleanor. Her voice was thin and brittle, like dry leaves. The imperious matriarch was gone, replaced by a whimpering elderly woman. She wept into the phone. "Daniel, I know you have every reason to hate us. We were cruel, we were wrong, but she was your wife, my Jessica, my daughter. She has nothing. We have nothing. We're living in a tiny apartment. For the memory of God, Daniel, can't you find it in your heart to show some mercy?" He listened to each of them, these architects of his deepest pain, as they laid their ruin at his feet and begged for him to rebuild their lives. They hadn't changed. They hadn't learned a thing. They were not sorry for what they did. They were only sorry for where it had gotten them. They still saw him, not as a man they had wronged, but as a resource they had failed to properly exploit. He sat in the silence of his office for a long time after Eleanor's call. He could have ignored them. He could have changed his number and let them fade into the pathetic obscurity they had earned. But he knew he wouldn't. His vow had been about more than just success. It had been about justice, and justice required a verdict. A verdict had to be delivered face to face. He picked up the phone and dialed the number Jessica had called from. She answered on the first ring, her voice breathless with hope. "Hello, Jessica," Daniel said, his own voice calm and steady as a surgeon's hand. "I've thought about it. We can meet. I'll choose the time and the place. I'll be in touch." He hung up, the finality of his tone leaving no room for argument. The final act was about to begin. He would be the one setting the stage. Daniel chose the time and the place with the precision of a master strategist planning the final move of a chess game. He sent a single, concise text message to Jessica. "The Bluebird Diner, corner of Elm and 4th, tomorrow, noon. Come alone, or don't come at all." He knew, of course, that she wouldn't come alone. They were a pack, bound together by their shared ruin, and they would face him as one. The Bluebird Diner was not a neutral location. It was a declaration. It was a small, unpretentious place with worn vinyl booths, the smell of burnt coffee and frying bacon thick in the air. It was the kind of place his mother had worked in for 30 years. It was a place of honest, unglamorous work, a world away from the silent, polished opulence of their fallen mansion. It was his home turf. He arrived 10 minutes early, taking a booth in the back corner that gave him a clear view of the entrance. He ordered a black coffee and sat, perfectly still, a picture of calm control amidst the gentle clatter and bustle of the lunchtime crowd. He felt no nerves, no anxiety. The years of rage had been forged into a purpose so hard and so pure that it left no room for petty emotion. He was not here to yell or to gloat. He was here to close a circle, to deliver a final, long overdue accounting. At precisely 5 past noon they entered. The small bell above the door chimed, and Daniel watched as the three of them stood blinking in the unfamiliar light, looking utterly and completely out of place. They were a shipwrecked crew washed ashore in a foreign land. Their clothes told the story of their fall more eloquently than any news report. Jessica wore a dress that might have been fashionable 2 seasons ago, now looking just slightly tired and worn. Mark was in a suit that no longer fit his frame correctly, the shoulders slumping, the fabric cheap. Eleanor, the former matriarch, clutched a generic, worn-out handbag, a phantom limb where a designer brand used to be. They looked diminished, faded, like old photographs left out in the Sunday. They huddled together, their eyes darting around the noisy, crowded diner with a mixture of fear and disgust. Daniel didn't stand. He didn't wave. He simply met Jessica's eyes from across the room and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod toward the booth. He watched them navigate the narrow aisle, their movements stiff and awkward. They slid into the vinyl seat opposite him, a silent, miserable trinity. The power dynamic in the small booth was palpable. Years ago in their home, he had been the supplicant, the insignificant beggar. Here, in this humble diner, he was the king on his throne, and they were the ones begging for an audience. A cheerful waitress with a pencil behind her ear appeared. "What can I get for you, folks?" she asked. Daniel smiled faintly at her. "Just a refill for me, thanks, Brenda." They stared, flustered, at the plastic-coated menus as if they were unreadable ancient texts. They mumbled orders for water, their voices barely audible over the din. Once the waitress left, the performance began. Eleanor, her voice trembling with a practiced frailty, spoke first. "Daniel, we don't know what to say. We know we don't deserve your forgiveness." Her eyes were watery, her hands twisting the paper napkin into a shredded mess. Jessica leaned forward, trying to inject a desperate intimacy into the moment. She reached across the table as if to touch his hand. "Danny," she whispered, using the old pet name. He subtly moved his hand to his coffee cup, a small, almost invisible rejection that was as effective as a slap. She flinched and pulled her hand back. "What my mother is trying to say is that we are so sorry. I was a fool. I was a child. I let them poison my mind, but I never stopped." "We made a mistake," Mark interrupted, his voice a low growl of forced humility. "I made a mistake. I was an arrogant idiot. I get it. I lost everything. I'm not asking for a handout, Daniel. I'm asking for a chance to work, to prove that I've changed." They went on, a desperate, overlapping chorus of self-pity and rehearsed regret. They spoke of their tiny, cramped apartment, their mounting bills, their failing health, their public shame. They painted a meticulous, detailed portrait of their misery, laying it all at his feet, expecting him to be moved, to feel pity, to open his wallet and wash their problems away. And through it all, Daniel remained silent. He didn't argue. He didn't accuse. He didn't correct their self-serving narratives. He simply listened, his gaze moving from one to the other, his expression unreadable. His silence was a weapon far more potent than any words he could have spoken. It was a vast, empty void that they frantically tried to fill, and the more they talked, the more their desperation showed, the more they exposed the raw, ugly truth of their motives. They weren't sorry for the sin, they were sorry for the consequences. In his silence, Daniel was remembering. He saw the rain-streaked windows of their mansion. He heard the sound of their laughter, cold and sharp. He felt the phantom weight of his dying mother's hand in his. He saw the man he had been, broken and alone, and the man he had become, forged in the fires they had lit. Finally, their words ran out. Their pathetic stories and empty apologies hung in the air between them, dissolving into the background noise of the diner. They fell silent, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and terrified hope. They stared at him, waiting. The entire axis of their future now rested on the word of the one man they had so carelessly broken. Brenda returned and refilled his coffee cup, the simple, mundane act, a stark interruption to the immense gravity of the moment. Daniel picked up the cup, took a slow, deliberate sip, and placed it back on the saucer. The small click of ceramic against ceramic seemed to reverberate through the booth, a sound as final and definitive as a judge's gavel. He had heard enough, he had seen enough. The time for listening was over. Daniel looked at the three of them, these broken remnants of a fallen dynasty, their faces etched with a desperate, hungry hope. He let the silence hang in the air for a moment longer, a tangible thing that amplified the frantic beating of their hearts. He picked up his coffee cup, took a final, slow sip, and placed it back on the saucer with a quiet, deliberate click. The sound was a gavel falling, signaling the end of their testimony. He looked directly at Jessica, then at Mark, and finally at Eleanor, his gaze as steady and as penetrating as a surgeon's scalpel. "No," he said. The word was not spoken with anger or malice. It was a simple, flat, and absolute statement of fact, as unchangeable as the laws of physics. It landed in the center of the table and shattered their fragile hope into a million pieces. They stared at him, their expressions morphing from hope to disbelief, then to the first dark shades of indignant rage. "No?" Jessica whispered, her voice a pained squeak. What? What do you mean? No. I mean I will not be giving you any money, Daniel clarified, his tone perfectly even. I will not be funding your second act. I will not be bailing you out of the consequences of your own choices. To do so would be to rob you of the only valuable thing you have left, the lesson. Before they could erupt, he reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and produced 3 separate items. He slid the first, a simple business card, across the table to Mark. My company is breaking ground on a new downtown skyscraper next month, he said. The man on that card is my site foreman. Be there at 6 a.m. Monday. He'll have a hard hat and a shovel waiting for you. The pay is weekly. It's an opportunity, Mark, to learn what it's like to build something from the ground up, instead of tearing it down from the top. Next, he slid a folded brochure across to Jessica. It was for a downtown career counseling and vocational training center. You are an intelligent woman, Jessica, he said, his voice devoid of any warmth. You were simply never taught to be a self-sufficient one. These people will help you identify your skills and find a job. It's time you learned what it feels like to earn your own way in the world. Finally, he pushed a thin manila folder in front of Eleanor. Her trembling hands opened it to find a lease agreement and a set of keys. That is for a 1-bedroom apartment in a respectable retirement community on the north side of the city, he explained. It is clean, it is safe, and I have paid the rent for 1 full year. It will give you a roof over your head. There you will find that a person's worth is measured by their kindness to their neighbors, not by the name of their ancestors. They stared at the items on the table as if they were venomous snakes. This was not help. This was a sentence. A carefully crafted punishment designed for maximum humiliation. A construction worker? Mark spat, his face turning a blotchy red. Is this some kind of sick joke? You're throwing us away, Jessica cried, real tears of frustration and rage now streaming down her face. After everything, you're just throwing us away. It was then that Daniel raised his hand, a simple gesture that silenced their protests instantly. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping, compelling them to listen. You still think this is about money, he said, a profound weariness in his tone. You still don't understand. He paused, looking at a point somewhere beyond them, remembering. That night, after I left your house, I didn't give up. I went to a man, a loan shark, and I took a loan at an interest rate that would have crippled me for life. I got the money for my mother's surgery. The operation happened. She didn't survive it. He let that sink in, watching the confusion and shock dawn on their faces. You see, he continued, his gaze returning to them, cold and clear. That night, I never truly needed your money. I needed to know if I had a family. I needed one shred of human decency, one flicker of compassion. I was testing you, and you failed in the most spectacular way imaginable. The dollar I asked for was symbolic. It was a test of your character, and you showed me you had none. You didn't just deny me a loan. You laughed. You felt nothing. Your refusal didn't kill my mother, but it killed every last trace of the love and respect I ever had for any of you. He stood up from the booth, his full height seeming to cast a long shadow over them. My offers are not charity. They are consequences. Mark, you will learn humility. Jessica, you will learn independence. And Eleanor, you will learn to live without the status you valued more than a human life. The offers stand. Your choices from this point on are your own. He placed a crisp $20 bill on the table, more than enough to cover the check, and turned his back on them for the last time. He walked out of the diner and into the bright afternoon sun without looking back, feeling not the heat of victory, but the clean, quiet peace of a debt finally paid. Later that evening, Daniel wasn't at a celebratory dinner or a high-powered meeting. He was at home, in the quiet of his study. He held a small, simple silver frame. In it was a photograph of his mother, taken years ago on a sunny day, a wide, genuine smile on her face. He had built an empire. He had faced down his demons. He had fulfilled the vow made in the ashes of his grief. He had not become them. He had become the man his mother had always believed he could be. Never underestimate the silence of a man who has endured too much. For when he finally speaks, it is not with a plea, but with a verdict. And true justice is not the fire of revenge that burns all bridges, but the cold, clear light of truth that illuminates them, forcing everyone to see the path they chose and the destination they earned. Thank you for listening. Join us next time for another story from Truyaken and GIA, did in US, where every closed door hides a secret.